right, I'm imagining everyone taking their seats. And now I will say an official welcome. I'm Rabbi Abigail True. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Living and the Sana Ben Center for Israel at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. And I am so happy to welcome all of you to join us for this hour of learning and thought-provoking thought leadership, as always, from our dear friends at the JCC, our neighbor, I should say, right, neighborhood rabbi, our neighbor, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. First of all, I should say that this session is being recorded. So as we ask questions or as the conversation unfolds via chat, know that it is being recorded and there will be some way to find it later on. Rachel Kunstat, give a wave, Rachel. Rachel is our program manager at the JCC who will be handling those details moving forward, and she will be with you for the second of these two-part series as well. So a word about our dear friend Rabbi Telushkin, who is one of the most warm, generous, and generous-hearted people I have ever met, and whom I've had the privilege of working over the past few years, as he usually is one of our key speakers at the Tikkun Leil Shavuot each spring. And sometimes we're lucky enough to get him during the year as well. But Tikkun is something that I know his speaking we all look forward to. And this year it didn't work out. The Tikkun was online and there was all sorts of reasons. And we're very grateful to you for generously offering to teach another time. And so here we are on a sultry summer afternoon, blessed to learn from you. A word about Rabbi Telushkin. He's the author of 16 books on Judaism. His book, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, inspired Senators Joseph Lieberman and Connie Mack's Senate Resolution number 151 to, get this, establish a National Speak No Evil Day in the US. I feel like we need to unearth that one again. We could go back to that. It was envisioned as a day for which Americans would go for 24 hours without saying anything unkind or unfair about or to anyone. His book, Jewish Literacy, The Most Important Things to Know About the Jewish Religion, Its People, and Its History, is one of the best-selling books on Judaism of the past 2 decades. Every Basics of Judaism class I have taught, including the one I'm teaching tonight, uses it as a textbook. More than 2 decades after its publication, the book remains a foundational text for Jews and people who are not Jewish and prospective converts. The first volume of A Code of Jewish Ethics, You Shall Be Holy, in which Rabbi Telushkin regards as his major life work, apparently, you'll have to tell us more about that, was published in 2006. It won the National Jewish Book Award for Jewish Book of the Year. The second volume was released in 2009. In 2014, Telushkin released Rabbi, which appeared on all of the major bestseller lists, including New York Times bestseller list, the Wall Street Journal, and Publishers Weekly. We are so blessed to have one of the country's most sought after speakers with us this afternoon. And now I will mute myself and you can unmute yourself, Rabbi Telushkin, and we are blessed to learn from you.
Can I be heard? Didn't I just press on? Yes. Yes, I can be heard. Okay.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. Okay. First, I want to thank Rabbi True, and I want to thank Rachel Kunstat. They've both been very wonderful to work with. Rachel, I've met only more recently. Rabbi True, I've been working with for a few years, and it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm very impressed with both of you. So thank you so much. I'm in the beginning process of writing a book, and so everything hasn't yet been finalized, but it's a book I've been envisioning writing for many years, and its working title is The Power of Moral Imagination. What do I mean by that term? Extraordinary advances have been made in the last century and more in medicine and science and technology because people have utilized the full resources of their intellectual imagination to solve problems that had been previously thought to be insoluble. Advances in ethical areas have been more inconsistent. There have been definite areas where there has been substantial improvement, and yet we know that the last century actually had more violent murders in it than any preceding century. And I'm talking about, coming from governments and other places. So it's been more of a mixed bag. I would argue that people rarely devote as much of their energies to trying to solve moral dilemmas as are solved by specialists in other areas. A lot of people don't necessarily think a second time, so to speak, about morality because they think it's rather simple and it's not complicated. But what I want to show are example after example of how by utilizing the full resources of their intellect, their moral imagination, they've often come up with solutions to problems others would have ignored. I am going throughout this talk, be vacillating, going back and forth between macro issues. I'm going to start with a macro issue, how it was leaders who have done things and utilized their moral imagination, and micro issues, how it challenges us in our own daily behavior. I'm going to give some examples later, even from the responses to the current COVID-19 crisis. And next week, God willing, I want to expand beyond that too. So I'm going to start now with an example of something done by a leader. And I'll be honest with you, this was not a leader who was thought necessarily to be a man of great intellect. And yet he did something, in my opinion, quite brilliant. And it's Dwight Eisenhower, the head general of the American Army during World War II. I was growing up as a little kid. I was born in 1948. I won't cause you to waste time. It means I'm 71, because I know people will make that calculation. And I remember the first time I was very young, but the second time I remember, Eisenhower ran against Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson was a very smart man, a very urbane man, a fine person, very witty. I'll give you just one example of his wit. In 1960, when John Kennedy was running for president, and there was still a big controversy in America whether a Catholic could be elected president, Norman Vincent Peale, the author of The Power of Positive Thinking and himself a minister, said that people shouldn't vote for Kennedy because it'll then cause the Pope to have too much power in America. And Adlai Stevenson at the time said, I have always found Paul appealing and Peale appalling, which I thought was a really witty comment. But in any case, Eisenhower was viewed by many people as being more of an intellectual lightweight. When I started reading about Eisenhower, I came across a very fascinating detail. It's a detail that should resonate with everybody, but will also in particular resonate with Jews. Eisenhower obviously was present as the Allies started to liberate the concentration camps. And he wrote to Secretary of State Marshall, who was actually was the head of the Army overall, that he made a decision. And this was his decision. As he wrote, Marshall was then the chief of staff, the visual evidence in the concentration camps of starvation and cruelty was so overwhelming to me to leave me a bit sick. In one room, there were piled up 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation. General Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things if ever in the future there developed a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. So here was Eisenhower in 1945 anticipating already the possibility that there might be a Holocaust denial campaign in the future. That's what I mean when I say by moral imagination. There's a teaching in the Talmud. It's a well-known teaching. It's in Pirkei Avot, and there are two versions of it in the Talmud. One of them is better known than the other. I suspect some of you here know it. It's a series of questions asked at the beginning of chapter 4 of the Ethics of the Fathers. Ezehu Chacham, who is wise? And the answer given there is Halomed Mikol Adam, one who can learn from everyone. There's another version, however, of that question in the Talmud, Ezu Chacham Haroeh Tanolad, who is wise, one who can see the future consequences of what's going on. Eisenhower had that wisdom. Today we know there is a robust, unfortunately, a robust Holocaust denial movement. You had the former president, Ahmadinejad, going out and speaking publicly about how the Holocaust was a fraud, organizing a conference in Iran to deny the Holocaust. You have a Professor Farrason writing a book in France that achieved great popularity denying the Holocaust. And who has the foreword to the book? None other than a Jew, a man named Noam Chomsky. They took from Chomsky's writings. He made no effort to stop them to do it. And he wrote the preface to a book denying the Holocaust. His words appear as a preface. Chomsky has repeatedly argued that one can deny the Holocaust and not be in any way considered an anti-Semite. Is Chomsky a significant academic? It turned out a number of years ago when they cited the citations of academics in papers throughout the world, he is the most cited academic in the world. So here you have General Eisenhower, not thought of as a great intellect, but when it came to moral imagination, being quite brilliant. And you have Chomsky, who actually came from a Jewish family background. His father was a famous Jewish linguist, allows his writings to be used by pro-Nazis. And when he was actually asked by a New York Times reporter about his views on the Holocaust, he says, "I have no views to state on the Holocaust." I presume he thinks it happened, but that's what happens when you have somebody who has moral imagination and you have someone who, in my view, doesn't. But you can foresee consequences of significant consequences of acts. Let me give you another example. It's a moving example. This is actually quite a Jewish example. Theodore Roosevelt, popularly known as Teddy Roosevelt, and this was a man who had flaws. Some of them, we know a lot of people had views in other times that we're not necessarily so impressed with. But Roosevelt always had a very friendly attitude towards the Jews. And I want to read to you about an incident that happened in 1895. Roosevelt that year was the chief of police for New York. And a group of German, not German Jews, but a group of German New Yorkers from Germany. And Germany, remember, even prior to the Holocaust, I know people often speak about how well Jews were treated in Germany, but even prior to the Holocaust, there had long been a very significant anti-Semitic tradition in Germany. And so a group of Germans were bringing over a Rector Alwart, to give a series of anti-Semitic talks throughout, I don't know if it was throughout the United States, but certainly in the New York area. Roosevelt writes about this in his memoirs, and he tells the following. When I was police commissioner of New York City in 1895, an anti-Semitic preacher from Berlin, Rector Alwart, came over to New York to preach a crusade against the Jews. Many of the New York Jews were much excited and asked me to prevent him from speaking and not to give him police protection. So how does Roosevelt respond to that? So he says to them, I told them your request is impossible, and even if possible, would be undesirable, because it would make Rector Alwart a martyr. The proper thing to do is to make him ridiculous. Accordingly, I detailed for his protection, and I'm using language the way people spoke in those days. Accordingly, I detailed for his protection a Jew sergeant and a score or two of Jewish policemen. Alwart made his harangue against the Jews under the active protection of some 40 policemen, every one of them a Jew. So here again, we see moral imagination. He was looking for a bigger picture. He did not want to turn Alwart into a martyr. Jews don't even let him speak because obviously he's going to tell the truth about them. He didn't want to do that. He said our goal should be to make him ridiculous. Again, a striking example of moral imagination. Let me give you now a third example, drawing once again, as I put it, from the macro world. I'm going to start by sort of posing a question. Unfortunately, the nature of our format today doesn't really allow, for an interactive discussion. And happily, we have quite a large gathering of people here. I'm very profoundly moved. And so I'm going to approximate what it might be like if we were having it more interactively. But here's my question. If for some reason it was very, very important to you that you could become very famous, and there are no shortage of people who want to be somewhat famous, but let's say you wanted to be really famous, your name known certainly throughout the city, certainly throughout the country, and maybe even throughout the world, and you wanted to become very famous within 1 week of today. Unfortunately, virtually the only way you could guarantee that that would happen is by doing a profoundly evil act. There is no good act that you could put a time limit on and say, hey, within 1 week, I'm going to do this, and you'll see everybody's going to know my name. But if you want to really become very, very famous, and that's a dominant concern of yours, so you can do something terribly evil. You could, God forbid, assassinate a president. You could assassinate, as John Lennon was assassinated. You could carry out a school shooting. I wrote an op-ed a number of years ago, submitted it to the New York Times. One of the editors at the Times accepted it, but then the other editors didn't want to include it. What did I want to write about there? We don't really know how to stop school shootings. For those of us who favor greater gun control, and I'm very sympathetic to much of that campaign, even if we started to institute it, it would take quite a while till we could get enough guns out that we know that we could really stop it. I wanted to do something that might have a more immediate impact. So I made the following proposal, and I was not the first person to ever propose this. And what I proposed was that newspapers and television and radio stop announcing the name of the murderers when they carry out these mass shootings and not show pictures of them. The only names that should be mentioned are the names of the victims. But in actuality, the exact opposite is what happens. The victims are immediately forgotten, and the murderers get that publicity, and to many of them, it's very, very important. I remember once in talking to Abraham Twersky. Abraham Twersky is an older gentleman who was a Hasidic Rabbi, but really, in particular, he was a psychiatrist. And Twersky remembered being called in a case of a child, it wasn't a child then, he was a young man like in his 20s. The father was a prominent person who knew Twersky. He wanted Twersky to go see his son who was in prison. I think he had done an armed robbery, possibly at a bank. I don't remember where it was. And Twersky said, and this young man who had been overshadowed perhaps by his father, when Twersky went in to speak with him, the first thing he said was, did you see my picture in the newspaper today? We know that very, very commonly, I'm forgetting the name of the man, and maybe in line with my own practice, I'm not mentioning the man's name, but you remember there was a terrorist, an Islamist terrorist. Again, I'm only mentioning that he was an Islamist. I'm not saying a Muslim, because they are a very extreme wing of Islam, the Islamists. And he had driven a truck down a side street in New York and had murdered 80 people. And the next day, it was reported, reliably reported, that he was sitting in his hospital room just watching himself on television and reading journalists and reading articles about him. So that's what I wanted to do. Will it save many lives if journals stop doing this? I don't know. Will it save at least one and possibly far more? Of that, I am absolutely certain. So I was very impressed in the aftermath of that terrible terrorist shooting in New Zealand, which was directed against Muslims, that the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and her name I do want to pronounce correctly, Jacinda, you see, I'm probably getting it wrong, Ardern, that she made the following pronouncement about the murderer without naming him. He sought many things from his act of terror, but one is notoriety. And that is why you will never hear me mention his name. He is a terrorist. He is a criminal. He is an extremist. But he will, when I speak, be nameless. And to others, I implore you, speak the name of the lives who were lost, rather than the name of the man who took them. In the aftermath of the first of the school shootings that became very famous, the one that was, at Columbine in Colorado, enormous attention was given to studying the two teenagers who carried out that murder. Can one reasonably argue that anything that was learned from that, and by the immense publicity that they got, can anyone argue that we learned enough to help stop other such shootings? There is no reason to publicize these people's names, and there is good reason to believe that by not doing so, other people's lives will be saved. Again, Ezehu Chacham, who is wise, one who foresees the future consequences of his acts. So as I said, I wanted to just start for a few minutes speaking about a macro issue, and throughout the book that, God willing, I will complete. A lot of books can get started without being completed, but that I really hope will happen. I want to shift back and forth between macro and micro issues. Here's more of a micro issue, and I direct this towards people here who have children, people here who have grandchildren, with a very great awareness of the power of words and how words that hurt can inflict permanent damage. I know I, as a parent, have sometimes said things that caused hurt, and it's one of the, and for which I'm profoundly regretful. It's one of, it might be inevitable, but the problem is even many good words sometimes can be overwhelmed. I'll tell you what made me particularly acutely aware of this. I sit on the board of a Jewish organization called the Jewish Book Council. And it's a very common feature that at the meetings of the council, a writer, usually somebody who's written a recent book, will come in and speak with us. And one year, we had a man who had recently won a Nobel Prize. His name was Eric Kandel. And Eric had written a book on memory. He had gotten the Nobel Prize in medicine, but the book dealt with issues involving memory and the physical process and how we remember things. And a lot also had to do with his own experiences. He had been born and grown up in Austria. And then after Kristallnacht, after the Nazi started to reveal the full intensity of their evil plans for the Jews, he and his family escaped. And he then went to the school I had attended as a child, the Yeshiva of Flatbush. And so I asked if I could meet him. And I'm waiting there. He's about a 70-year-old man at the time. This was quite a while ago, would have been in the very early 2000s. And I am waiting for him. And then the elevator opens. He comes out and he says, Professor Kandel, hi, I'm here to meet you from the Jewish Book Council. My name is Joseph Telushkin, and we actually have something in common. We both attended the same day school. Now, the day school I attended, the Yeshiva of Flatbush, had a profound effect on my life. The founding principal of the school was a very significant figure. He had founded the school in 1928, was a very significant figure in education. He also was a man who had a rather bad temper. And so Kandel said to me, what did you think of? And he then mentions this man's name. Since I'm not speaking in a particularly complimentary manner, I did note what an impact he had on Jewish education. So Kandel looked at me and said, what did you think of? And he then mentioned the man's name. Now, it so happens I was not a good student in school. I ended up doing better once I got to college, but in elementary school, and even then in high school, I wasn't really a good student. So I said, well, he wasn't particularly nice to me. I wasn't a good student. And he could be quite insulting. Anyway, so Kandel said, you too? He said, I was there on scholarship and he didn't let me forget it. At that moment, this 70-year-old man who had won the Nobel Prize, who I subsequently became quite friendly with, I had occasion to speak in his honor at a dinner for Chabad at Columbia University. He is an exceedingly nice person. At this moment, that 70-year-old man, it was as if he was a 10-year-old. The pain from his childhood was still so present in him. And I could see that. That's why I remember once coming across a line, I forget who said it, but it was quoted in, Yeats quoted it in something he had written. It was a relative. He said, the pain of children is worse than the pain of adults, because adults can envision an end to their suffering, and children, when they suffer, often can't envision an end to it. And I saw it then at that moment, how careful one has to be when one is speaking to children, particularly if one does it more often. And then the observation I had made from seeing Dr. Kandel's pain was reinforced when I was reading an autobiography of the writer Issac Asimov. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Asimov. Asimov had writing abilities that shocked me. He wrote or edited something like 500 books. He could just sit down and write at a prolific speed. And he writes in his memoirs, he said, I've always thought of myself as being quite an extraordinary person. His self-confidence, though, was shaken when he was about 15 and he was in high school. And he had to produce a report. He had to write a short story, and he started writing the short story. And the teacher stopped him in the middle and used, since I feel funny using the word that the teacher used, was what we used to call like a dirty word. He used what used to be called a barnyard epithet. I don't know if anybody under 40 will have the slightest idea what word I'm thinking of, but anyway, that was a term we used to use for an unpleasant four-letter word. And he said, this is a piece of, okay. Asimov was shocked to hear such a word used and was obviously quite embarrassed. And the class started really laughing. Asimov said, as he looked back at the story, he saw that what the teacher had said was actually pretty accurate. As he put it, he had affected a style. He wanted to sound very smart, so he used overly fancy words that were inappropriate, and it really didn't read well at all. And he then worked again on improving his writing and submitted a humorous piece for the annual issue that the teacher would edit by the students. And when he thanked the teacher for publishing his humorous piece, the teacher said, well, it was the only humorous piece that was submitted. It really wasn't very good, but it was the only humorous piece I could choose from. Asimov writes, he was so wounded by that. Asimov wrote his memoir when he was sick with a fatal illness. He died, I think, at 72, and he was like over 70 when he was writing his memoir. And he writes, this was the cruelest blow I had ever received to my ego. And he said, I hate this man. He names him in the book. Obviously, I'm not going to name him in the speech. His name was, let's call him Max N. Actually, I don't remember if he gave his whole name, but he said, I hate this man. He said, had that man encouraged me and given me, tips on things I could do, and I then did go on to have, Asimov went on to be really one of the most famous writers of his generation, I would have always credited him as being my discoverer. Instead, all I can say about him is he was a lousy rat. That's what happens when you give a hurt like that. It certainly happens when you publicly humiliate somebody. And that's, of course, what Asimov had done. Are you allowed to criticize people? Of course. Maimonides, and maybe if I have a chance, I'll speak about this also next week, because again, it involves moral imagination. Maimonides writes, when you criticize them, first of all, criticize them in private. Criticize them with using gentle and reassuring words. There's a whole method if you want to criticize someone. And people sometimes say, I find it very hard to criticize. I say, the first question you should ask yourself before offering criticism is, am I looking forward to offer this criticism? Because if you are, then you're not really sincere. If you're looking forward to saying words that will hurt another person, even if it'll end up being for the person's benefit, but you're looking forward to that, then you're not the person who should do it. You should be a person who thinks, I really wish I didn't have to say this, but I think it's really important. And obviously, in Asimov's case, that's what the teacher did. Now, sometimes even loving parents can unintentionally do things that are hurtful, and that's true. And obviously, you have to, again, think through what are the implications. There was a book that became a big bestseller a few years ago in the United States called Confessions, I think it was called Confessions of a Tiger Mother. And it's about a mother who had raised her children with very strong demands on them for perfection. And she writes how when she was a kid, her family had migrated. They were of Chinese background, and they all turned out to be very successful. The woman herself is a professor at Harvard, as is her husband and their children, who are doing very well. But she demanded great perfection from her children growing up. And her mother claims that, and her daughter claims that the mother says she doesn't remember it. Her daughter says that when she was once playing a piano piece and continued to make some errors, that the mother said to her, if you don't get it right the next time, I'm going to go up and burn your dolls. And the girl did get it right, but it was very unpleasant. And I happened to hear this woman giving a speech on Fire Island. And I went over to her afterwards and I said to her, I'll tell you the truth. I came to this speech expecting not to like you because I thought your book depicted a very harsh way of treating your children. And she argued, she had argued in her book that that type of strictness would ultimately produce more productive children and they would do well and they would ultimately thank you for this. And I then told her, because when I read that episode, it reminded me of a book I had read many years ago by an American actor named Jackie Cooper. Cooper, and I'm speaking only with the most minimal notes, so I hope I'm not making any mistakes. If I'm not mistaken, Cooper and his age at that time had been the youngest person ever to win an Academy Award. I think he was 9. And he started out, in the earlier stages of film. And one of his abilities was he could cry as a kid and evoke the audience's sympathy. But as he started getting older, it was not so easy for him to cry on demand. So he was being directed in a film, and there was a scene where it was important for him to cry, and he couldn't cry. He had a little dog with him, and the director had one of his assistants take away the dog and say to him, if you don't get it right next time, we're shooting the dog. And sure enough, the next time he didn't get it right. And then he hears a shot. He assumes his dog has been shot, and he then does the scene crying appropriately. The dog, of course, really had not been shot. And when I told this woman that it reminded me of that scene, she was horrified, that such a thing had happened. I know one technique I had practiced with my children. I used to often offer them prizes if they did better in certain subjects that they were struggling with on exams, and sometimes then they'd say, and what if we get 100? Because the highest prize was for getting 90 or over. And they said, what if we get 100? I said, I'm not giving you anything extra for 100. I never want people to feel that they have to be perfect, because we're all not going to end up being perfect. Even if we're perfect once or twice, it's not going to do it. So again, Ezu Chacham, one who's wise, who foresees the consequences of his actions. I'll give you another example with a not such obvious teaching from the Talmud. I sometimes like to start a sentence and ask people to fill in the last word. For example, when I wrote a book, a biography of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I said, I'm going to start a sentence, see if you can fill in the last word. It begins, anything worth doing is worth doing. And overwhelmingly, people answer, as we've always heard that expression quoted, anything worth doing is worth doing well. The Rebbe's approach, which I'm not going to get into now, but I'm just giving this as an example, but the Rebbe's approach is anything worth doing is worth doing now. And G.K. Chesterton, the British literary writer, used to say anything worth doing is worth doing badly, because what he meant was if it's worth doing, do it. And if you can't even do it well, it's better if you do something. Anyway, there's a teaching in the Talmud. A parent should never promise to do something for a child and not fulfill what they said they were going to do, because what's the because you'd fill in? And people often will fill in because the child will be very disappointed, the child will be hurt. But what the Talmud says, no, because the child will learn from the parent's behavior that it's all right to lie. And I think that's a very acute observation. If children grow up thinking that when parents promise they're going to do something for them and then the parents don't do it, so it means that, okay, in the real world, in the adult world, you can say you're going to do something and then really, though, lie about it. I want to go now into another area in the next few minutes, because we only have a few minutes left. There was a book I read a couple of years ago. I was fortunate enough to also give one of the blurbs to the book, though the book became such a popular and widely used book. I'm one of more than like 20 blurbs on the back. And the book is called Give and Take. It is written by a man named Adam Grant, who's been a professor at the Wharton School of Business for many years. He's quite a number of times been voted as the most popular member of the faculty. And in Give and Take, he investigates many economic and other issues, many of them issues that are partially economic, but have implications in other areas. And one of the results of looking at different studies was he found out the following. To classify in a very broad manner 3 types of people, he said there are people who are givers, they're generous with money, they're generous with their time, they're generous with helping others. There are people who are takers. We can all guess, what he means by that. They will take advantage. And then there are people who are matchers. And the matchers are people who'll do for you what you'll do for them, which is also a very common characteristic. Studies that have been done, because in the world of business, many studies get commissioned because it has financial implications and people often want to know what's going to happen. So studies repeatedly documented that givers tended to be the lowest earners of those 3 categories of people. That I think takers might have earned somehow maybe with the most, or matchers, and then followed by givers, which is obviously a little depressing. But then when he teased out the data, he showed that there was a subset of givers who actually earned more than the other 2 groups. So he became intrigued to figure out what is different about the givers who earn more and the givers who earn less. If you want to think about it for a minute, see what you come up with. On the other hand, I suddenly realized if I waited a whole minute, I could do it at a speech more easily than at an online speech. But he discovered a very interesting phenomenon. And when you hear it, it'll sort of make sense. Givers who confined their giving to other givers and to matchers did indeed do better than others. Because in the process of helping people who were grateful people and who were generous people, these people also found opportunities to be helpful to them. The givers who also gave to takers, and obviously the first time someone asks you for a favor, you don't know whether or not they're a taker. But usually, after a period of time, we can start to appreciate if somebody is a taker. So the people who did not give to takers actually ended up doing better. The people who did give to takers, they're the ones who ended up at the bottom, because forget even just money issues, their time would often be really wasted by people who didn't have rachmanis, who didn't really have compassion for them, but really were only interested in advancing their own interests. If this teaching has any implications in your life, then gesundheit, go ahead, and I hope you can take advantage of it. I want to finish up with a few thoughts now on what's been going on in COVID-19. And it's a section of the book that I want to call When Nothing Can Be Done, Something Can Still Be Done. And we've known that this COVID epidemic has had some very devastating effects. And we don't know when there'll really be a recovery from these effects, including people who've lost jobs. I certainly know my income has been very significantly affected by this, and so many other people's has. And then there are, tragedies, or things that I would say are less than tragedies, but are very, very sad. Okay, I'll give one example. I wish I hadn't started by using the word tragedy, but just something very sad. My telephone just went off. I hope that'll stop it. Children's birthday parties. So obviously you can't have birthday parties when people are in quarantine and isolated. And then somebody, I don't know where it started, but then somebody came up with the idea of driving up to the house of a child who's having a birthday party, and people calling out happy birthday, people honking their horns, and that at least released some of the pain. Because there's a double pain when you can't have a party. One is because you're really looking forward to the enjoyment of the party and the fun and the opening of the gifts and the games and where you might go. And the other reason, of course, is because you like to know that there are many people who want to come and celebrate your birthday party. And the fact that so what people realized is, can we find a way to help people, even though we can't fulfill the need of providing that actual good time, we can fulfill the need to feel affirmed and liked by other people. And so they found a way to do it. Nothing can be done, something could still be done. I'll give you a more dramatic example of it than that. Anybody who's ever attended a burial after a death at a Jewish cemetery knows that after the body is buried, and the funeral and the service is over, the people who are comforting the mourners, which means all the other people in attendance, except for the immediate mourners, form two lines facing each other, and the mourners walk between the two lines, and people call out to them words of consolation. It could be the traditional Jewish consolation. For those who are more conversant with the Hebrew, Hamakom Yinachem Etchem, may God comfort you among all those who mourn for Zion and Jerusalem, or people can call out other appropriate words of consolation. And obviously what happened in the aftermath of COVID was usually only like one or two people could even go to the cemetery, sometimes not even that. And then people couldn't make Shiva calls. So there was that additional feeling of pain that the community could not affirm itself on your behalf. And then I found out that in one place, I haven't tracked down yet where it was, somebody wrote me about it, maybe other places started doing it, people would come in their cars before the burial service, and they would come into, usually many synagogues have parking lots, they would come into a parking lot or they'd find another parking lot. Remember, there was very little traffic going on in the first days of COVID. They'd come into a large parking lot, cars would line up opposite each other, and then the mourners' cars would go down the middle and people would open their windows and call out words of consolation. I was very moved by that because it again underscored to me, guess what? We have the ability of moral imagination. So when it seemed, okay, this is very sad, but what can I do? Guess what? You can still find something you can do. I remember very early in the COVID crisis, I was reading I want to just check my time. Okay. Very early in the COVID crisis, I was reading of a pizza parlor that had to close because it was doing so little business. But there were so many healthcare workers in the neighborhood, because they were in a neighborhood that was very near where there were many hospitals, that the pizza parlor decided to stay open. And every day they made about 500 pizzas to deliver to people. That's moral imagination. But what made the story even more heartwarming was, and that landlord, when it wasn't clear what landlords were going to do, that landlord immediately announced that until the crisis was solved, he was not charging them any rent. They all wanted to participate in it. Nothing can be done, something can be done. That's what we have to always think of. My dear friend Donna Gilbert, when her husband Spencer, these were very, very important, beloved friends of mine. Spencer, unfortunately, is no longer with us. Donna is. He was diagnosed with a type of very rapidly advancing leukemia, and it became very quickly obvious that he was going to have a very, very short lifespan. And they were so trying at the hospital to keep him safe from any infection that everybody had to come into the hospital, totally with masks. So what Donna told me she did, and again, I don't know if such a thing would have occurred to me, but I'm so happy she shared it. Because of her sharing it with me, it now occurred to me to do, is that she would knock on the window of his room. He would hear her, he would look at the window, and he would see her without a mask. Then she would enter the room with a mask. But if all she had always done was just go into the room wearing a mask, it would always just underscore that all the reality was the sickness that there was there now. And I've since heard of doctors and nurses at other hospitals who have now chosen to put photographs of themselves, usually smiling or other, with pleasant facial expressions on their suits, so that patients can see who it is that's treating them. I want to resume this next week. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to meet with you. I want to resume and talk about other subjects, moral imagination and how we use language, how we choose to criticize, how we choose to express anger, other insights about visiting the sick, how to give people hope, even at times when it's difficult for us to have hope, how to express gratitude. There are many areas which I want to cover. I want to make a request of you. If any of you are aware of incidents you've come across where you've seen somebody use moral imagination, it could hopefully happily be you, or incidents you've read about. I'd love it if you could send them in to me. If you're the first version of such an incident that I get, the first type person of such practice, I will obviously want to cite you in my book, and I want to quote you by name. So if you're interested in that, you can send me an email at Telushkin, Telushkin @AOL.com. And thank you very much for attending this class, and we're on again next week. And Rachel, I'm now open for some questions.
Hi, yes. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat or also use the raise hand function. And you can say the question yourself. We just ask that you keep it brief. So it looks like we have a question in the chat. Are there books and or practices in Judaism or Kabbalah that come to mind that historically have been go-tos for generally stirring creativity or specifically moral imagination?
Yes, but a lot of them, for example, I found many great ideas in the 13th century Sefer Hasidim. What I've tried to do earlier in my career, this book is just going to be on moral imagination, but I earlier wrote a book, and the book I'm working on now will not just be Jewish. That book was overwhelmingly only Jewish. There's a book called The Book of Jewish Values, and I tried to come up with an ethical activity for every day of the year. It was disturbing to me. One of the disturbing things that happened to Judaism and modernity is that when people use the word religious, it's usually to refer exclusively to ritual observance. So if you hear that somebody's become religious or someone is religious, you assume they keep kosher, they keep Shabbat, And if somebody's not religious, they don't keep kosher and they don't keep Shabbat, and you can form the peculiar impression that in Judaism, ethics are an extracurricular activity. So I wanted to write a book to give ethical advice for every day. And, and that attempts to do it. I'm hardly the only book, that's done it. You pick up a book called Do Unto Others by Abraham Tversky. I think it's impossible to read that book and not become a better person as a result of it. And all of Tversky's books are very powerful.
Great. Any other questions? You can put them in the chat or raise your hand using the raised hand function that's under participants. There's a place to raise your hand.
Oh yeah, in the meantime, I'll mention another book. There's a book called A Tzaddik in Our Time about Rabbi Aryeh Levine. Also is a man who devoted himself to living a life of kindness, and God willing, I'm involved in a project now that God willing will result in a documentary film about him. Okay.
Anyone else? I'm not seeing anyone. We have about 7 minutes if anyone has a question.
If nobody has a question, I'll tell another story.
Someone asked for you, you can tell another story just quickly. Someone asked if you could talk about your mystery series.
Thank you. If more people asked me about my mysteries, I probably would have continued writing more mysteries. I don't know if they did that well. I had always found the genre of mystery writing to be interesting. So unless you're writing what they call in the mystery world a police procedural, chances are you're going to develop your own detective, and it'll probably come out of your own observation. So my hero is a character named Daniel Winter, who's a rabbi who solves mysteries. And obviously I tie them in to his specialized knowledge of Judaism that he can then figure it out. And for example, I did one of the books called The Final Analysis of Dr. Stark. And it's about the murder of a gossiping psychiatrist. And I related it obviously to the laws of Lashon Hara, that are the backgrounds. Or I wrote a book called An Eye for an Eye about can an act of vengeance or revenge ever be a justified act? And it picked up on an interesting theme. It actually became the basis for several episodes of a television show in the 90s called The Practice. So I really found it an interesting, it was interesting. I don't have any others planned at the moment. I did do one book, another mystery book, which was probably the least Jewish of any of the books I wrote, called Heaven's Witness, about reincarnation and the solving of a crime. Should I conclude with one last story? Or is there another question?
There are a few more questions.
Okay, so take that. That's what we said we were going to do.
Have you been included in ethics reviews in a medical setting for the purpose of moral imagination?
No, somebody who heard me speak on it, I went up to speak. It was a major hospital. Now I'm embarrassed. I'm forgetting the name, in the Bronx, to speak on that there. But you know what? Maybe I will tell one little story about it because it comes out of medical ethics. When you offer criticism of a person, how do you offer? And I would be, by the way, I'm open to that, to speaking in medical context, because I think a lot of this stuff has importance in that area. And when I was writing on this subject, I came across once in a medical textbook the following story. So I don't know the name of the doctor who was involved, but it's a very powerful story. How do you offer criticism in a way that will actually motivate the person to change? And he did that. It was a doctor who was teaching in a medical school, and he raised the issue, the one thing a doctor should never do is deprive a patient of all hope. So there was a student in the class who argued, who raised his hand, and he argued, and he said, no, we're men of medicine. We're people of medicine. We're supposed to be truthful. If there is really nothing we can do for a person, that's how we should act. And the doctor said to him, I think that attitude disqualifies you from being a doctor. I want you to leave the class. I want you to go to the dean's office, and I want you to tell him that I think you should be thrown out of medical school. The student was stunned. He couldn't take it seriously. And the doctor waited a minute, and then he said, no, please leave immediately, and please go down to the dean's office. I want you thrown out. He finally got up to leave the room. As he reached the door, the doctor said to him, it's okay, you can sit back down now. I just wanted you to know what it's like to be deprived of all hope. If that story didn't change that student, then I can't believe there's anything that could. But that's, again, moral imagination. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Do we have time for one more question, or are we done for the day?
No, I have time for one more question.
Okay, the last
Just
question.
warning, I won't be able to conclude on such a dramatic note, though.
So that last question is, in what ways do you think we are in a new moral age, either going forward or backward, speaking about the polarization of society?
I think the polarization is as bad as I've ever remember it being in my time. I think it is a bad time, and I think when polarization happens, the results can be very catastrophic. I want to address it. I will address that in part, God willing, next week when I speak about manners of speaking, how we speak about others, how we express anger, and how we speak fairly, even to those with whom we sharply disagree, and even with those who we might quite dislike. Because if we can find any common language, the depths of hatred that are going to happen will bring about, we know terrible things can happen. Maybe the Civil War was unavoidable. It was over such a critical issue. But maybe other things could work in different times. And maybe the crisis need not be as extreme as people on both sides feel it is. And the more extreme people feel it is, the more they speak in extremist terms about others. And in my biography of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I have a chapter, I'm going to touch on it next week, called How to Disagree Without Being Disagreeable. And that's crucial. Now I'll say thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Telushkin. So everyone will come back to next Tuesday at noon. Same link on Zoom. I'll send out a reminder, but it was great seeing you all, and have a wonderful week.